This children's story that I wrote seems particularly relevant right now, so I thought I would read it to you. The Little Blue Book That Wanted to Be Read. Once upon a time, there was a land where books were not allowed. Books tell stories, the king said. And stories mean imagination, the queen said. And that means imagining your own story, the king said. So books are not allowed, they said together. And so the people forgot their stories. It became a land without happily ever after. In fact, it became a land without happiness at all. Then one day, a little blue book snuck over the mountains. It ran down the street and right into Joe. "Read me," the book said. Joe picked up the book. "What are you doing here? We're not allowed to read." The book opened to its first page. "Once upon a time," Joe whispered. Everybody read books, big books, small books, thick books, wide books, sad books, books on bed, books on buses, books on toilets, books in the park, books in the bath, books under the table, and books in backpacks. The little blue book shouted, because it was so happy to be read. "Shh," Joe said, but it was too late. "I hear a book," the king said. "Books are not allowed," the queen said. "Because books tell stories," the king said. "And stories mean imagination," the queen said. "And that means imagining your own story," they said together. So they sent the book police to search the kingdom. They looked at every school. "What would we do with a book?" the teachers said. "Everyone knows books give you cavities." They searched every library. "Books," the librarian said. "Books are horrible things that clutter up our nice, clean shelves." And in the illustration, the teachers and librarians are secretly hiding books, because of course they still love them. Then the book police knocked on Joe's door. "You have a book," the first officer shouted. "Books are not allowed," the second officer said. "Because books tell stories," the third officer said. "And stories mean imagination," the fourth officer said. "And that means imagining your own story," they said together. And so Joe and the little blue book were thrown in jail. There were many other books in the jail. They were too frightened to speak. But the little blue book said, "I may be blue, but I want to be read." "Hey," Joe called out the little window, "listen to what this book says. It says, 'Once upon a time.' Once upon a time, it had been a long time since the people had heard these strange, exciting words. They began to remember many things, their names, their favorite foods, the things their dog said, the feeling when someone hugged them. One little girl remembered where she had seen a key. Once upon a time, the king hid it in this flower pot. And so she picked up the key and opened the door to the jail. Joe and all the books burst out. 'Once upon a time,' the books shouted, 'we were locked up, but now we're free.' The books ran all over the city and opened themselves up to their first pages. 'Once upon a time,' they shouted. Then everyone began to remember. Big stories, small stories, long stories, short stories, stories on the toilet, stories in the park, stories on buses, stories in the bath, stories under the table, stories in bed. Every kind of story, even stories that began with happily ever after and ended with once upon a time. Then books of all colors ran up to the king and queen's castle shouting, 'I want to be read, I want to be read.' 'Books are not allowed,' the king and queen shouted. 'Once upon a time,' the little blue book said. 'Once upon a time,' Joe said. 'Once upon a time,' the book said. 'Help,' the king screamed. 'I'm scared of books.' 'Help,' the queen yelled. 'I'm scared of stories.' 'Help,' the king said. 'We're scared of imagination. We're scared of imagining our own story,' they said together. They tried to run away, but they fell right into a pile of books and disappeared into a story where you could imagine anything, even happiness. 'Once upon a time we weren't allowed imagination,' the people said. 'Now we have books.' And there were books everywhere, books riding buses and sleeping on shelves, books swimming in the ocean, playing soccer and taking their kids out for ice cream. Some books were even allowed in the schools and libraries. The people were free to remember their stories and to read the books that they liked. Even the little blue book was often read. There were not only happy endings, but endings of every kind had returned to the kingdom. And what happened to the king and queen? They would show up every now and then in the people's books. They're shown happy inside a book behind the lines of text, along with members of the book police. 'Once upon a time, we never imagined our own story,' the king said. 'Once upon a time, we never imagined imagination,' the queen said. And together, 'Once upon a time, we never imagined happily ever after.' So that's my story. It was never published, but I thought I would share it in this time of book bans and lack of happily ever after and not being able to be yourself. Thanks for listening.